We ended the last lecture module by talking about that first general kind of problem that behaviorists face, the problem of stimulus generalization. Let's turn our attention in this module to what's called poverty of the stimulus, oftentimes in the literature. So methodological behaviorists face a problem of trying to explain learning just relying on classical and operant conditioning, when that learning oftentimes seems to cultivate robust generalized response patterns from relatively impoverished and highly noise-filled stimulus histories. And the question then becomes, how can such robust behaviors emerge from such inadequate and defective stimuli? And psychologists tend to refer to this problem as the problem of poverty of the stimulus. Now, there are a number of different sorts of problems that fall under this overarching rubric, and they all speak to the same sorts of difficulties. We can see Chomsky thinking about this in that review when he says every time an adult reads a newspaper, he or she undoubtedly comes upon countless new sentences which are not at all similar in a simple physical sense to any that he or she has heard before and which he or she will recognize as sentences and understand. He or she will also be able to detect distortions or misprints. So our behavior is very robust and flexible, and we deal with a great deal of novelty, and actually we generate a great deal of novelty as well. So I'm going to focus in on 5 generally acknowledged types of poverty of stimulus. The first one is probably the most straightforward. The number of stimuli, the number of sentences or linguistic utterances or exposure episodes that a child is going to have during that period from 7 to 10 years in which they become roughly fluent in the language is going to be extremely small relative to the enormous class of grammatical sentences that they will then seemingly be able to process and generate with little difficulty, even though those sentences may or may not be at all similar to sentences they've encountered before. So there's just a size relationship. How is it that we have this robust, complex, diverse, and novel behavior that gets produced from this relatively small number of potential learning experiences? Our second kind of poverty of the stimulus is what Lasnik and Liz call degeneracy of quality. Well, in the first case, the difficulty lies in the disparate sizes between the initial data set, the experiences that the child was going to have in learning the language, versus the performance set, the number of sentences that the child might be asked to generate or to understand is just so dramatically disparate. The stimuli so small relative to the expected response size. In the case of degeneracy of quality, the problem has to do with the quality of the data set itself. Namely, the data set seems to be full of errors, full of noise, and this makes it even harder for the child to generalize off to this robust performance across a wide variety of circumstances. Now, the errors and noise that you might find in a typical data set will include things like speech errors, so misspeaking, pronunciation differences that are the result of non-native speakers speaking the language, slips of the tongue, and so on. So here's a nice example of something like that.
I hope they now go and take a look at the oranges of the...
In addition to slips of the tongue like that, and where you describe the oranges of an investigation instead of the origins, degeneracy of quality can result even from innocuous and pervasive things like small speech disfluencies. Now, speech disfluency is just a break or an irregularity or a non-lexical vocable in our speech pattern. They include things like when you make a false start on a sentence, or when you cut yourself off before finishing a sentence, when you pause like that, when you introduce a filler like so, maybe, and when you engage in a reparation, when you go back and correct a slip of the tongue. By some estimates, speech disfluencies make up as much as 20% of ordinary speech in ordinary contexts. And so they represent a huge source of degeneracy of quality, of contamination or introduction of noise into the stimuli from which children learn the language. A third phenomenon that's often referred to under the general rubric of poverty of stimulus is called positivity. And Pullum and Scholes, for instance, point to positivity, noting that children, generally speaking, are almost always presented exclusively with positive instances, that is, grammatical instances. They're never given examples of ungrammatical formulations to contrast with the grammatical formulations. And so in this way, they don't have instances of when the rules are broken. Stimuli also exhibit what Lasnik and Lids call degeneracy of scope. That is, the stimuli that children encounter include precious little information regarding the scope or proper application of any rules they exhibit. So not only do we not exhibit when the rules get broken, but we also don't give them much information about what the rules are or what their scope or proper application is going to be either. Finally, each child's stimulus reflects what Pullman and Schultz call idiosyncrasy. That is, though learned linguistic behaviors seem to converge significantly around a general pattern of linguistic usage, the data sets from which individual children learn the language seem to differ fairly significantly. They lack the homogeneity that you see in the performance of the children after they've learned the language. One way to sort of think about this is if you wanted to create a sort of uniform linguistic behavior, then teaching people a language as you do in a college class might be a great way to bring that about. So they all have the same textbooks and they're all studying the same things at the same time with the same vocabulary and the same examples. And that should probably bring a lot of convergence in performance. But that's not how children are taught out in the wild, as it were. Children are exposed randomly to all sorts of different language with all sorts of different contexts and all sorts of different orders, so that there is no curriculum in the way they get exposed to the language that would be likely to produce this convergence of linguistic behaviors.